For lesson 14, we're going to focus on yet another genre of literature that we have not covered yet, and that is relatively new in terms of being studied at universities, with film, just as we did for comic books and graphic novels in the previous lesson. With film, though, we're adding another layer to the discussion because of the issue of adaptation, which is obviously crucial to our study and to literary studies in general and to film. Many of the classic novels you'd read in classes like this and classic pieces of literature have been adapted into films, and most of the popular novels today are probably books you've read and liked and enjoyed. So some questions ultimately arise of what constitutes a good adaptation. What are the guidelines to follow? And opinions differ on this, so I'm going to offer you several views on it in the lesson. So there's two parts essentially to this lesson. The basics of analyzing film, just film itself, as a unique genre and a unique medium, and then the second layer with adaptation, which complicates that analysis. So just as we went over with comics last time, film as a unique, relatively new genre, new form of media for analysis, it has its own unique elements that are intrinsic and unique to it that you don't find in other forms and genres, and we're going to briefly cover those elements now so that you can be prepared to use them when you analyze the Captain America film as part of your post. Film is a uniquely visual and auditory medium, so you see and hear things with film, which is not something you get, reading a novel or reading a poem. You get the visual aspect when reading comics, but not the sound, the auditory aspect. So with this unique medium, there are different things to look for than you would think of in other mediums. Mise-en-scene is a term that refers to everything that appears in the shot on the screen. So when you're analyzing film, you think about the shots that you see, the images you see. If you're watching a DVD or Blu-ray and say pause it, everything you see in that still image when you pause it, that all falls under the very broad category of mise-en-scene. So this is one of several important terms I'm going to give you here that are helpful for analyzing films. The second is cinematography, and we're proceeding in a direction here where I'm kind of breaking down the scenes, the different elements, and giving you terms for analyzing them. So if mise-en-scene is everything that appears in the shot on the screen, cinematography is how the shot is filmed. Is it a close-up of someone's face? Is it a wider shot where you can see more? Is it panoramic to capture the landscape? So on and so forth. If you have mise-en-scene is everything that appears in the shot, and cinematography is how that shot is filmed, editing, following along in our sequence here, is how the shots are pieced together. So if you think about a film, when you go and see a film in the theater, it's this whole cohesive piece in terms of story and all the scenes. It's all come together. I mean, maybe if it's poorly written, it doesn't feel cohesive, but ideally it's this cohesive thing. It doesn't begin that way. It kind of works backward, and if you look at the filmmaking progress, you can kind of deconstruct it. So shots are filmed, not necessarily in order. Certainly not all of them are used, but the ones that are used are sequenced together, spliced together, pieced together by the editors. And so there's different cuts you can make from different scenes to scenes. Maybe one fades in or fades out, or it's a quick jump cuts back and forth of different characters' faces in an intense scene, so on and so forth. That's all done in the editing process. So certainly things like cinematography and editing are not factors that you consider when analyzing a novel, but they're factors that you can't ignore when analyzing a film. If you just talk about the plot and the dialogue of a film, you're missing something unique to that genre in your analysis, and you don't want to overlook things like that. Finally, we have a whole litany here of other things that don't necessarily need their own description because it's more implied, but they're clearly part of the unique medium of film. Costume design, makeup, visual effects, soundtrack, score, acting. So obviously how the characters look, the sounds we talked about earlier, but here it's important to keep sound effects, soundtrack, and score different. The sound effects are various sounds you'll hear in the film outside of the character speaking. Soundtrack is music, they call it non-diegetic music, music that's not part of the scene taking place. If a character is listening to a song on a radio, that's part of the scene, but oftentimes in films, not musicals, music just plays over, and that's the soundtrack. But that's different than the score. Soundtrack is usually popular songs that are pieced together and used in the movie. A score is typically instrumental music that's written for the movie. So these things are all different, and they all, become part of the mise-en-scene when you hear them in the scene, and are different things you can look at when analyzing the film. And of course, obviously, acting comes into play, the performance the actor gives, and this kind of goes along with costume design and makeup. What does a character look, act, and sound like? These are really important things to consider. It may seem, if you haven't been part of the filmmaking process, it may seem kind of superficial or unnecessary, but if you're talking about, filming a movie, say an adaptation of, say, something like Macbeth, if you watched any of the trailers to Macbeth back when we studied that play, what should Lady Macbeth look like? What kind of dress should she be wearing? Would different types of dresses or different kind of makeup or different actresses, the way they look, the color of their hair, etc., would that impact how Lady Macbeth is perceived? And an important thing to take along with this is that every adaptation, this is going to transition to our next slide, is an interpretation. We said before, every translation is an interpretation when we were studying Beowulf. So is every adaptation. For instance, if you recall from your discussion board post, there's typically two ways to think of Lady Macbeth's character. She's either a very sympathetic figure because her guilt and her paranoia and her suicide indicate that she shows guilt and remorse, or she's this very ambitious figure who actually drives Macbeth to do it. Of course she prompts him to, but there's a more kind of aggressive way to view Lady Macbeth as really pushing him into it. And so two different views of her that critics are split on. The way a film is made, with subtlety and nuance, can capture either one of those views and reflect, what the filmmaker's opinion is. So choosing how she looks, how she's dressed, etc., can convey that. There are certain clothes and colors, say, softer colors that might make her seem more sympathetic, or brighter, more vivid colors might have the opposite effect, etc. So all of these factors that you may not have thought as much about before when you're watching film come into play. We'll talk about this more in a minute, but when you do your discussion board post on Captain America, rather than looking at the language, which I've asked you to do in the 13 posts so far, I'd like you to look at these kinds of factors. What the scenes look like, how they're shot, the colors, the sounds, etc. So all of these factors that are unique to the genre of film come into play when you start talking about adaptation. Adaptation is important. As long as films have been made, going back to the early 20th century, they've almost always had adaptations as part of the process. And this is because if a book or a play or something else, a comic book, is popular to begin with and sold a lot, they call this pre-selling, then there's a good chance, the film will also be successful. And so adaptations are a very safe way for movie studios to proceed with their money. So you get quite a few adaptations. And just as we need a framework for evaluating film or comics or any genre, we need a framework for evaluating adaptation. And in Robert Stam's article I asked you to read as the lens text, he's a really renowned film critic, I think really outlines the different issues involved with adaptation. And the central issue here with adaptation is letter versus spirit. So Stam in his piece is kind of responding to traditional views of adaptation. He's reacting against those. And the word fidelity and other similar words have been used a lot in discussions of adaptation, and this bothers Stam. He doesn't think it's a fair a fair critique to. In other words, we're talking about frameworks here, critical approaches, way to analyze texts. And so using fidelity as a lens or a way to analyze film and evaluate film and critique it is not a fair approach in Stam's mind, because fidelity looks at how closely the film follows the letter of the original text. Scene for scene, shot for shot, line for line, event for event. Changing a dialogue, cutting events or scenes out or adding one thing, these would all go against the fidelity. And so following this approach, a film that does these things would not be considered successful. Is this fair or not? Is it fair to say that because a film deviates in some kind of significant way from the original text that it's a bad film? That's the question that's posed here. Stam would answer no, that's not fair. You may disagree. You certainly can, and I ask you to say whether you agree or not in your post. So what does Stam offer instead? He says translation. And I use the word spirit here, which I can see now I misspelled. I should have looked at that more closely. But I can see, or I use the word spirit to kind of help clarify this. I think letter versus spirit really helps explain Stam's argument. So the idea of letter versus spirit. Letter is following the original text to the letter, scene for scene, event for event, dialogue for dialogue. Capturing the spirit of the text is a bit different. It looks at the text. This approach, asks the filmmaker, look at the text, see what the major themes and issues, ideas are, what is the central message of the original text, and then making a film that the filmmaker believes in the best way possible conveys those ideas, conveys that message. And what Stam's essentially saying here is that, let me bring up the next point because it helps with this. He's saying that film is a very different medium from novels or plays or even comics. So all those factors we just talked about on the previous slide that make film unique, if other forms of literature don't have those qualities, then it's not really fair to say that a successful adaptation is one that follows the previous work to the letter. And so I think Stam takes his argument so far, and I would agree, but you're welcome to disagree. He takes it to the point where following something to the letter can actually hurt the adaptation and make it not a successful adaptation. Because if you try to capture everything that's there in the original text, certain ideas or certain messages may be lost in trying to cram everything in, right? Whereas if you find and discover and locate the central idea of a text and then make the film in a way that emphasizes that, the message, the spirit of it might come through better than in a version that follows to the letter. So it's an interesting view. Certainly some would disagree, but I really see the validity in it. I'll use an example to illustrate my point. One of my favorite novelists, James Ellroy, writes novels. They're noir novels set in LA in the 1940s and 1950s against this kind of corrupt background. Several of them have been made into films. A really successful one called LA Confidential, and then a not so successful one called The Black Dahlia, that are part of the same series by Ellroy. And it's interesting how the filmmakers approach this, because LA Confidential is a big, long, kind of baggy book with Ellroy writes in short sentences, so a long book has got a lot in it. And they take out a bunch of it because in a 2.5-hour movie you couldn't fit it all in. They even add a scene, they take out other scenes, but it really captures the ideas that drive the text, and it stays true to the essence of the characters, and in my opinion is a great adaptation. The Black Dahlia, the filmmakers were less organized and less thoughtful and methodical, I say, and they make a crucial mistake. They begin by following the book to the letter, and it's a much shorter book than LA Confidential. It's still too lengthy to probably put everything in a film, but much shorter. So they start following it to the letter, and I was watching it the first time I saw it, and I was like, this is following the book really closely, was my thought, for the first half or so of it. And then I was thinking, how are they going to fit everything in? And then about 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through, following the book to the letter, they captured less than half the novel, and they had to cram all this stuff in at the end to get it to fit the 2-hour running time they'd wanted. But even if they'd stretched it to 2.5 or 3 hours or more, they wouldn't have been able to fit everything. And so it really ends up kind of dooming the film, because the ending is botched with following the letter so closely for the first 2/3. So it's just one example that illustrates how following the spirit rather than the letter may actually more closely convey the original author's idea. But there are certainly examples to the contrary, and if you want to cite them in your post, please go ahead. I'd be excited and curious to read them. This issue comes up even more in comic book adaptations, so I want to discuss that for a minute before we move on and look at the film. Last time when we were talking about comic books, we talked about intertextuality. Now, if you have a character like Captain America or Iron Man, who's been around a long time, 40, 50, 70 years in Captain America's case, over that period there will be dozens of different authors who write those comics for the comic book company. And there's obviously going to be differences. They're not all going to write the character the exact same way. So there's a spirit, I think you can start to see the connection here, to the character that the author needs to maintain in order for the fans to stay loyal and keep buying the comics. But there's also an element of intertextuality, where that author needs to be aware of the events and things that have come earlier and reference them and build off of them. So this becomes quite controversial when comic books are adapted, because of all the fans out there who want to see their works they love made into movies, the fanboys who read comic books are some of the most guilty for getting out there on internet chat rooms and forums and just, putting down the film adaptations. And so a lot of these fans, I'm not trying to generalize. I love comic books. I'm not necessarily this type of fan. I'm not trying to generalize, but you do see this a lot. They'll criticize a film for following, to the letter. Not following to the letter, a comic book film. But I ask the question, when you have a character that's been around for 70 years, and hundreds of different authors writing the comic, how can you even define what following the letter is in that case? So I would argue that you almost have to adhere to the spirit more. And one way to think about this is, if you have, say, Jack Kirby writing about Captain America in the 1940s, and you have Ed Brubaker writing about Captain America in the 2000s, Ed Brubaker, who was really successful at revitalizing and making Captain America popular again in the mid-2000s, he's doing a completely new take that's a little darker, it's a little more aggressive, a little deeper, but he's still staying true to the spirit of the character. And so a filmmaker making a comic book film is just one more writer after dozens or hundreds of other writers entering into that realm of that character, giving their take. And so if they stay true to the spirit, they're not doing anything really that different than, say, Ed Brubaker's doing 70 years after Jack Kirby. But they're also not following the letter. And in this case, I think comic books are what I'm saying here is comic books are an example where Stam's argument gives even more credence, even though he mainly just talks about novels. Lastly, I'll make the point that you've had a lot of comic adaptations recently. It's sort of become the big new popular genre in Hollywood. That's one of the reasons why, besides personal interest, I've chosen to focus on it in this lesson. And you've had some successful adaptations, both critically and commercially, and not so. And in my opinion, letter versus spirit is the reasoning here. A lot of critiques have been leveled against the most recent Spider-Man films, which are technically a reboot of the franchise because they started over. And I think a lot of those critiques are justified, and I agree with them. But one of the positive things that's been said about those films is they claim that they follow the letter of the comics more closely. Because in the comic books, Spider-Man dates Gwen Stacy for years and then she is killed before he meets and dates Mary Jane Watson. And the first series of films by Sam Raimi from the early 2000s start with Mary Jane Watson and completely ignore Gwen Stacy. Well, Gwen Stacy in the comics is not the most interesting character, and the films that were produced later on, although the first ones are very problematic, are weaker films for the most part. And so, by introducing a character first that comes along chronologically sooner, you may be following the letter more closely. But if you're completely ignoring the spirit of that character or of the franchise and the main character in general, how can you call that a successful film adaptation? So, it's an interesting point. And a good counter example are the films made by Marvel Studios, which Spider-Man's a Marvel comic, but Universal owns the rights, Sony owns the rights, so Sony made those films, whereas certain properties like the Avengers, Captain America, that Marvel still owns, they've made their own films through Marvel Studios. And those films have been generally praised by fans and critics and much more commercially successful. And in some ways maybe they follow the letter, but I think they're mainly successful because they follow the spirit. A lot of films from the early 2000s like X-Men, and yes, those Spider-Man films are critiqued too, and Fantastic Four, have received complaints from fans, but I think those more so don't follow the spirit. They change certain things about a character's personality and who that character is. A good example would be the Iron Man films. In the comics, the character of Pepper Potts is an older woman who really becomes like a mother figure to Tony Stark after his parents are killed when he's a young man. In the films, Marvel makes her into a younger woman who becomes a love interest for him. So this certainly changes the spirit of her character, but she's always been kind of a peripheral character. Whereas Tony Stark himself, even though this major part of his life, the woman he spends it with is changed, is very true to the type of character he was in the comics. And so the Pepper Potts change seems to not bother fans the way other changes have been made, and I think that's not because it's a less significant change, but because the main character, they've stayed true to the spirit there. And so that's just yet another example to illustrate this point. Alright, let's round out the lesson by talking about the film I've asked you to analyze. So again, I've asked you to look at the film. So you don't need to cite any quotes, any language from the text in this lesson. This is the one lesson where you don't, like you have in the 13 lessons that came before this. But I do want you to cite a specific scene from the film. So you can describe what happens in the scene, how the characters look, the colors, the music, the sound, etc. Any of those things you want, anything from the mise-en-scene. Summarize that briefly and then explain how the examples from the mise-en-scene that you've cited support your argument. And the question I'm asking you to answer, well, first I ask you, do you agree with Stam or not? And then I ask you, does the portrayal of Captain America in this film stay true to the spirit of the character that you encountered when you read the Civil War comic for the previous lesson? Marvel's actually making a film based on Civil War that also is placed in the Captain America franchise. Well, it's not out yet. It comes out in May. But the Winter Soldier, they chose to address many of the same issues in this film that appeared in the Civil War comic, such as issues of paranoia. Post 9/11 paranoia, which leads to that debate of national security versus individual liberty, because you have the SHIELD agency creating these helicarriers that can target any individual and kill them. So that's removed a huge amount of individual liberty, but if the people being killed are terrorists, then it's also contributing to national security. So it's not the same issue that's explored in the Civil War comic we read, but since the Civil War film is not out yet, it's a great film to look at in terms of, does this adaptation stay true to the spirit of the comic, because it addresses essentially the same issue with a lot of the same characters showing up, primarily Captain America. One key difference, though, I would say, is the whose side are you on thing is not present. This is perhaps because once Hydra enters the scene, you have a pretty clear hero versus villain dichotomy. Perhaps earlier on, when Captain America and Nick Fury are debating the intended use of the helicarriers by S.H.I.E.L.D., you could get into the whose side are you on thing. But once Fury is taken out and Alexander Pierce is revealed to be a villain to the audience, not to Captain America, or, Captain America figures it out early on when he's in his office, then the whose side are you on thing is kind of no longer a part of it. But the same issues are still explored. What the filmmakers have chosen to do in removing the whose side are you on question is making Captain America reverse virus. It's an interesting approach. In many ways, of the films that have been made by Marvel, not by the other studios, that are considered part of their Marvel Cinematic Universe, you could argue that Captain America the Winter Soldier is the grittiest of those films. But Captain America himself, and this goes back to the spirit of the character, is probably the least gritty character. And so what they've chosen to do is take the least gritty character and drop him into the most gritty environment. And I personally think that's what makes this such a compelling film, is because then he functions like a reverse virus. All of the other characters in the film, I guess you could say, except for maybe the Falcon, but all of the other characters in the film are corrupt or not being straightforward with people to a certain extent. Obviously, you have over half of S.H.I.E.L.D. really working for Hydra, but you also have characters like Black Widow and Nick Fury, who, even though they're heroes and part of the good guy team, so to speak, they're not being completely honest with Cap. They're doing other things on the side. Even if they're doing those things for good intentions, Captain America still sees the withholding of that information from him as a kind of violation of trust. And so, even for the other characters who are also considered good guys, so to speak, he still has this positive influence on them of this uncorrupt figure in a completely corrupt world. And that makes for a slightly different take than in the Civil War comic, but a very interesting storyline to look closely at. Part of what happens here then obviously is the corruption in S.H.I.E.L.D., which again goes back to the paranoia and kind of implies a lack of trust in traditional forms of authority, such as the government. So this idea relates to the previous bullet point, and I mentioned earlier how in the early 2000s Ed Brubaker, the comic writer, revitalized Captain America. Well, he did this by making Captain America, the world of Captain America comics, more gritty. And now, the important thing here to consider is letter versus spirit again. Brubaker, in doing this, is keeping Captain America, he's maintaining the spirit of the character that goes all the way back to the 1940s, because he's not making the character grittier, he's making the environment around him grittier, which makes for a really interesting storyline, because then you have this kind of reverse virus thing going on. And so one of the things that happens here is most of S.H.I.E.L.D. is really working for Hydra, who are the bad guys, so to speak. And so Captain America, the figure you would think in the 1940s, when he's first around before he's frozen, who would be, the symbol for following the government and carrying out the government's mission here in the 21st century, he's questioning what the government's doing. You have this kind of role reversal for him because he's a man out of time placed in this other time. And so that makes the world surrounding him very complicated and complex and ambiguous, and I'd love to see you kind of pick that world apart in your posts. What you have is the symbol of America challenging authority, is essentially what we just said. And again, the issues that come up that cause him to challenge authority relate to individual liberty. He's the sentinel of liberty, and he believes individual liberties being taken away by the response to 9/11, and you end up having the character who wears the American flag as his uniform challenging American authority, which again, makes for an interesting premise. This leads to an ensemble cast. Part of what makes the film interesting is, unlike, say, Iron Man or Thor, where the film focuses almost entirely on the main character, you have a litany of other characters here that show up and are very interesting unto themselves. Falcon and Black Widow and Nick Fury and Maria Hill and Sharon Carter, and all of the villains, obviously, Alexander Pierce, the Winter Soldier. It's almost a cast like the Avengers itself, or the little mini-Avengers, and so there's potentially more depth there because you can explore the narrative arcs for those other characters. And in this film, the filmmakers specifically chose to focus in on Black Widow and make her kind of the second largest character in the film outside of Cap, which is an interesting choice. And she clearly contrasts him, because in all the ways he's the good old boy, she's the bad girl, so to speak, and is, while still doing things for the greater good, she believes, doing things covertly and in a manner that morally he disapproves of. And so I think you have an interesting flip of gender roles here, because often in these stories you have the heroic male figure being kind of the rebel and being the bad boy, and women representing traditional views. Women who have, going back to the texts we've seen, have either been an outsider or an other or a villain, like Lady Macbeth, like the weird sisters in both Macbeth and Dracula. Either Grendel's mother, you have earlier in text, you have the female is either the other or is kind of this pure figure. If women aren't the other and they're not the villain, they're this kind of pure, innocent, virtuous figure. Some exceptions, would be Sita in the Ramayana, who is still virtuous, but she's able to kind of argue and debate on an equal level with her husband. And then Mina Harker, obviously, represents traditional values as well as new ones. But Black Widow, I think, here does something similar to Mina and Sita to a greater extent. You think about Scarlet Witch being the villain in Avengers Disassembled, as we talked about in the last lesson and that article talked about. Here you have kind of the villain becoming the hero. She's doing all those things that Grendel's mother and Lady Macbeth and the Weird Sisters did that were problematic. She's questioning, challenging the hero, and not representing virtue and innocence, but the opposite. But in doing so, she's working for the greater good and ends up helping the hero. So the villainous kind of representation of femininity becomes a heroic one here. And I think this movie is really questioning a lot of challenging and questioning a lot of traditional characterizations, while still staying true to the spirit of how the characters were portrayed in the comics. So, as I said, these things are up for debate, and I'd love to see how you debate them in your posts. I look forward to that, but here were a few of my views to kind of get you started.